Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Chronic Fatigue and Burnout Recovery Podcast. Today we're going to do a Q&A episode, and just so you know what's in store for you, we've got some questions about pacing, we've got some questions around preventing muscle mass and muscle wastage, we've got some questions around the ketogenic diet, some questions around exercise and managing post-exertional malaise. So these questions were taken from my Instagram. Each week on my Instagram, or most weeks on my Instagram, I do a Q&A in my stories where I always get asked lots and lots of questions. And it is really hard to answer a lot of these questions in just, one story, a couple of sentences. So I like to pick some of the questions which are a little bit juicier, shall we say, and then elaborate in more detail on these on the podcast. So that's what we'll be doing today. I've also thought I'd just start off by saying that I've had a really, really crazy month. It was about 4 weeks ago today that I went to London on my somatic experiencing training to complete my advanced 2 in my somatic experiencing practitioner certification. And it has just been so hectic since then. Life has been so hectic since then. Whenever I take a week out, whether that's a week for a course or a week for a holiday, it always sort of throws a spanner in the works in terms of my work routine. Because you're sort of catching up with clients that you weren't able to see in that week, which means that everybody needs to get squished in somehow. And then there've been a few changes happening in the back end of the business. We're currently hiring a new practitioner. I've got some personal stuff going on in my personal life, which I won't elaborate on, but it's all really just been a lot. This week, actually, it's Friday. I usually record a podcast on a Monday, but I have been squeezing some extra business tasks in on Mondays, and therefore Friday is the only day I've been able to do this week. So I kind of feel a little bit on the back foot in terms of my planning and preparation. Usually I'm really organized with this type of thing, but I've missed a couple of weeks now of podcast recordings just due to some of the disruption. So this is my attempt today to get ahead. Okay, so I just had a little interruption. I had to run downstairs, 3 flights of stairs, and get a parcel and run back up again. But I think let's stop waffling on, and I will go straight into the questions. Just to say that some of the questions are incomplete sentences, because in Instagram you can only have a certain character limit in terms of the amount of questions you can answer. So some of them may not be worded in the exact way that they were asked. But the first one is somebody who is confused about pacing. It seems like it's just not doing things. And then I've added an additional question to this, which was asked by someone different, which was, does nervous system work count as pacing? So I'm going to weave my answer to these 2 questions together. First of all, to say that if you need more help and support with pacing specifically, I highly recommend you check out the Spoonie Mentor on Instagram. I've interviewed her in episode 55 of this podcast, so you can listen to that full, I think it's almost an hour-long episode where we discuss pacing in more detail. But pacing is ultimately moving through your day in a way where you have periods of activity and periods of rest. And it's not just a concept for people with chronic illness. Very often it's chronic illness which teaches us about pacing or forces us to learn more about pacing. But everybody in life needs to pace themselves. We can't go 100 miles an hour with no rest all the time. Life should have a rhythm. There should be periods of intensity and periods of rest and recovery. And that can be within a smaller cycle, like a day. There's periods of rest or periods of activity. Within a week, we have days which are busier, like Mondays may be busier than Sundays, for example. Within a month, there may be periods of the month where there's more going on and there's more busyness. And then there's periods of the month where we withdraw and where we retreat a little bit more. And then even in a year, we have different seasons. People may be out and about doing things in the summer And, the winter, we're sort of like hunkering down, we're snuggling down, maybe going to bed earlier, encouraged by the darkness, or at least we should be. So pacing is about living life in a natural and healthy rhythm. And that's on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis, a seasonal basis, and an annual basis. So there are going to be periods of life which are more intense, and then we're also going to have to balance those periods of life with periods of rest and recovery. And for chronic illness, what we're usually noticing is that somebody who is experiencing some sort of chronic health issue, that they have an unstable system. So they are unstable physiologically. And therefore, one of the things that we need as a foundation as we work towards improving health is to offer the system as much stability as possible. And part of that stability comes from the stability of creating a set routine. And that routine needs to be created around the capacity of the individual. So when we're talking about pacing specifically, and we're talking about these periods of activity and periods of rest, the periods of activity can include mental challenge, like reading or writing, or, when I'm working, I'm in a dialogue with someone, but I'm sort of keeping a mental note of all the things that they're saying and building a picture in my mind. It's a very, very mentally intense period of activity, even though my physical body is sitting still. We can also have physical activity, if you're doing housework or even personal care, like having a shower, washing your hair, brushing your teeth in some cases, where all of those activity levels need to be paced. And then emotional activity as well. If we're doing some deep healing and we're processing grief, or we're processing anger, or we're in a confrontation or a discussion with, a partner or a friend or a family member, it's going to take up an emotional load. It's going to be an emotional activity level. So we have different types of activity: mental, emotional, physical. And then we also need to have periods of rest. And here, rest should feel restful. And what that ultimately means is, on a physiological level, there should be signs that the body is resting. A slower heart rate, slower breathing, more sort of softness, less tension in the muscles. The mind should become less busy, less frantic, less anxious. So when we're choosing our rest activities, we need to choose things that actually are restful to the body, bearing in mind that different things will be restful for different people. And I remember working with a client, and it was quite a complex case, and it just kind of felt like we weren't getting any traction with the case. And I remember saying, do we need to review your pacing? I know you've done pacing before, but I just feel like with your symptoms and what's going on, like maybe there's some extra things we could look at. And they're like, no, I know all about pacing, and my pacing is fine. And I was like, oh no, maybe we should just look at this in a little bit more detail. Could you implement a mid-morning break? Maybe you can send me some ideas about what you could do in that mid-morning break to help you rest. And then, the person sent through their list, and it was like dry brushing, reading a book, like a whole bunch of things. And I was like, but there's nothing on here that is restful for you. So just because some things may be really, really restful for some people doesn't mean that they're going to be restful for you. So it's really important that you identify the things that help you to rest. And in my own journey, it wasn't anything overly complicated. I would literally just go lie down on my bed for 10 minutes to an hour, or lie with my legs up the wall and just watch my breath, just listen to some relaxing music. Or maybe it would just be lie on the sofa and watch a light-hearted TV program. So it doesn't have to be a meditation, because sometimes if we're doing a meditation, we have to mentally work very hard at following the meditation. It doesn't have to be some deep nervous system work, because sometimes when we're working with the nervous system, especially in these unstable systems, nervous system work takes a lot of energy. I'm seeing when I'm working with people in my Nurturing Resilience course and when I work with people one-on-one doing somatic experiencing, just getting them to connect to their body and notice the sensations in their body. They're working so hard because it's so new to them. And of course, if it's not new to you, or with time and practice, it can get easier, and then maybe therefore it's less hard work and more restful. But nervous system work, to answer the second piece of this question, isn't always going to be restorative. We might need to do some nervous system work and then actually rest afterwards to allow the body to integrate the work that has been done. That being said, there can be things like restorative yoga, which is very restful. I used to do a lot of yin yoga in my own personal journey, and that was very restful for me. And again, I would choose specific postures that weren't too challenging as part of the yin yoga. If you have a good cognitive capacity, lying on your bed and reading a book could be restful. But for somebody who really struggles to read, or with their vision, that may actually, in fact, be very tiring. And as an example, I was working with a client who was advised not to read. And she said to me, but I really love reading and it really helps me unwind before I go to bed. And I was like, well, yes, definitely, then you should read. But maybe for someone else, the reading isn't restful. So in terms of this confusion about pacing is not doing nothing, but it's about identifying the things that feel like work to you, whether that is mental work, emotional work, and physical activity work, and balancing them throughout the day with the things that do feel truly restful and restorative for your system. And sometimes it can, depending on how connected you are with yourself, it can take a while to work out what those different things are. And what I often encourage my clients to do is to have a rest menu. So they write down a list of all the things that they know help them to rest. And then when it gets to this allocated time in their day for that rest, then they can choose something off the menu that feels good in that moment. Because some days they may just need to lie down and have a nap. Other days they may be happy to do some reading or watch some TV. So it really depends on the day and what your system is doing at the time. And then in terms of how we structure it, a lot of people think pacing is like you do some stuff and then you just rest for the rest of the day. But it's about having a rhythm. So if we look at the human nervous system naturally throughout the day goes through periods of like activation as we're more engaged and out in the world, and then more settling. So a healthy nervous system should have lovely activation and settling cycles throughout the day. But what we often see in chronic illness is people get activated and then they get stuck in the activation, or people get busy and then they stay busy for too long and then they crash. So the goal here is to start to get to learn your body and how long it can do things for before you start to notice some symptoms creeping in, before you start to notice you feel quite tired. And the idea is not to push past the point where you start to touch on the very edge of your capacity. So for example, you're reading a book. Reading is a mental activity for you. You notice that you're struggling to stay focused, you're feeling a little bit tired, the letters are blurring on the page or whatever. Those are your signs. I need to stop. And then you need to put your book away, and then you need to close your eyes, lie down, breathe, feel your body settling, and maybe you do that for half an hour. Then you can get up and make some lunch. And by the time you've got up and you've made your lunch and you've eaten your lunch, and maybe if you're lucky, you can even wash up afterwards, then after that, you may be like, whoa, that was a lot of activity. My nervous system is just feeling a little bit activated now. Then you take another break so that settles. And then once that's settled and you're feeling a little bit more recharged, maybe you go for a short little afternoon walk if that's within your capacity. And you do your little 30-minute walk outside, and then you come home, and then you maybe lie on your back with your feet up the wall, get that blood flowing to your brain. And then when you feel recharged again, you do something else. And for some people, that could be an hour of work, an hour of rest, an hour of work, 30 minutes of rest. For other people, maybe it will only be 15 minutes of work and 45 minutes, an hour of rest. But the goal over time, if you're consistent with this and disciplined enough not to continue to overextend yourself, then the time you can do tasks for should increase, and the time that you need to rest for can decrease. There's obviously a lot of other physiological variables that we could layer into this. So if you're not stabilizing your blood sugar and your blood sugar is crashing, there may be a physiological crash versus a problem with your pacing crash that happens. So there are other things obviously running alongside the pacing, but learning the right pace for your system is an essential part of the fatigue recovery process. I don't really see anybody successfully getting better without proper pacing. And this is where I'll say time and time again on this podcast that the basics really matter. Mastering the basics of blood sugar control, sleep, pacing, nervous system support. Those are going to be some of your foundationals in terms of your recovery. So I hope that helps to clarify a little bit more on pacing. Pacing is not complicated. It's just boring, and it takes self-discipline. And most people resist the boredom and resist the discipline. But if you can master the boredom and you can master the discipline, pacing can be such a fantastic tool in your fatigue recovery toolbox. So the next question here is, when you become more regulated, is it normal that this feels weird or wrong in the beginning? And my answer is absolutely yes. So when you are experiencing the world, you are experiencing the world through your nervous system. And if your nervous system has been highly activated for a long period of time, or maybe very shut down for a long period of time, when you start to change your nervous system and you start to come into a place of more regulation, how you experience the world will be different. When I did my very, very first nervous system course, when I had trained to become a trauma-informed practitioner, I found the course so slow. I was just like, oh my gosh, like I did all the module on the first day, did all the homework on the first day, and I knew there was only 2 weeks until the next module was coming out, and I was like, this is so slow, this is so frustrating, I'm not getting anything from this, did I really make the right decision, why did I sign up for this, etc., etc. All the stories that a hyper-vigilant system would tell itself. And as my nervous system has changed over time, just generally in life, I'm able to be so much more patient. And I actually now, instead of wanting to fill space, I actually crave space because I'm so much better connected to the space that I need. But when this is new for you and you're like, oh, things are slow and it feels uncomfortable, that is just a testament to the changes that are happening in the system. What I'll often refer to when I'm talking about this with clients is we refer to the energy wells. And the energy wells is a concept that I teach in the Nurturing Resilience Group program. Our energy wells, as our nervous system changes, it's like the energy well gets bigger. So when you have a very small energy well, there's only so much we can move around in the energy well before we reach our capacity. But as our energy wells get bigger and bigger, we have more movement, we have more space, there's more capacity, there's more flexibility within the system. And it can feel a little bit disorientating because if you're used to living in a shoebox and now you get to live in a mansion, there's going to be all this space and you're going to be like, wow, there's all this space and it's just weird and I don't know what to do with it all. It feels so unfamiliar. I can stretch, I can move differently. So there is this feeling of even things which are positive, things which are good, things which are signaling healthy change within the system can still feel a little bit disorienting, a little bit weird. There can be guilt. There can be a sense of this is wrong. There can even be a sense of threat. And when we have that sense of threat, even if we're moving towards what we really want, which is more capacity and space within life, but that can feel threatening, and that's what can sometimes trigger this sort of relapses in chronic fatigue. Is sometimes I see with clients when things are going really well, they're like, oh, everything was going so well, and then all of a sudden it just wasn't. And I was like, well, maybe your body freaked out about the fact that things were going really well. We need to work on that. So to answer this question is yes. Even when you know that you're working towards more regulation, it can feel weird. because how you are experiencing the world is different to how you used to experience the world. And part of the work is just giving yourself time to integrate and solidify that new energy well, that new space that you're in. And this is where the less is more is so important, because sometimes we see a bit of progress and we're like, oh, I got some progress doing this, so if I do this even more, I'll get even more progress. But when we're working with these chronic and complex conditions, we want to get a little bit of progress and then just wait and give the system time to adjust to the progress, and then give a little bit more progress and then wait, give the system time to adjust. And I've got a client I'm working with at the moment, and we're doing this, and we speak every other week just for a short chat. And he's making progress, and I know where he wants to be. And every time he comes to speak with me, I'm like, so I think we should just do another 2 weeks and not change anything. And I said, I know it's boring, and I know you're really excited for more, and I know you really want to do more, but my gut instinct right now is we need to stabilize what you've gained so far. And I think I'm possibly driving him crazy, but this is the point I'm trying to make, is we need to give time to integrate the new layers within the system before we start to create more layers, because that can potentially be disruptive to the process. So let's move on to the next question, which is, can bodybuilding supplements help prevent muscle wastage? And specifically the question here was around amino acids and creatine. And so I think loss of muscle mass is obviously a concern for health in general. I know when I first became unwell, having come from a bodybuilding background, not that I was a professional bodybuilder or anything like that, but I just like to train in that style of training. I had spent so many years trying to build up my muscle mass and eat lots of protein and all of these things. And the idea of no longer being able to exercise, I was really concerned about losing muscle mass. And so what I will say first and foremost is that unless there's something pathological going on, it's unlikely that you'll lose muscle mass very quickly, but it will eventually happen over time. How we can delay the loss of muscle mass is by making sure that we eat enough muscle meat, by eating enough protein in the diet. And that's where I really wanted to start off in terms of answering this question, because on this podcast, on my social media, on my blog, I'm constantly talking about the importance of stabilizing blood sugar and eating adequate protein as part of stabilizing blood sugar. And yet so many of the people who come to work with me, who found me through Instagram, through my blog, through my podcast, haven't optimized this step yet. And there's obviously many reasons why people don't do things, but it always makes me feel very curious that this is information that I feel like I shout from the rooftops about, and perhaps I'm not shouting loud enough, and I need to work a little bit harder at that. But everybody who comes to work with me, I still have to have this conversation with them, which is like, you need to be eating more protein as a whole. You need to be eating more protein at breakfast. You need to be stabilizing your blood sugar. And so if you are concerned about muscle mass, before you start investing in bodybuilding supplements, my first recommendation would be check your protein intake. And that means the ideal amount of protein is 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. So if your ideal body weight, let's just say for argument's sake, is 150 pounds, that's 150 grams of protein per day. Now, that doesn't mean if you have 150 gram chicken breast that you've then had 150 grams of protein and you're tick that box for the day. We have to look at the actual protein content of food. So 100 grams of chicken, raw weight, breast, uncooked, would give you 20 grams of protein. So that means if you're aiming for 150 grams of protein per day, that's the equivalent of 750 grams of raw chicken breast a day. Obviously, no one's going to go and eat 750 grams of raw chicken breast per day. You're probably going to want to make that up from other types of animal meat. So maybe you have 200 grams of chicken breast with a salad at lunchtime. Maybe you have 200 grams of steak in the evening. Maybe you have some eggs and smoked salmon for breakfast. And then if you're struggling to get your protein up, yes, you could use like a protein powder supplement. You could use an amino acid supplement, and that would be supplementary to your protein intake. But I don't think that unless you're eating enough protein, there would probably be no added benefit of adding in amino acids. Although the caveat to that is branched chain amino acids can help to stabilize blood glucose if you're somebody who's hypoglycemic, so has a tendency towards low blood sugar. But that also does not negate doing the work that you need to do to support the low blood sugar generally. You can't just take the amino acids and hope for the best. You need to do everything to support the low blood sugar and then add the amino acids on top. And creatine can have creatine can have some benefits in terms of energy production. I think I did a blog post on creatine and long COVID a while ago, and quite a few people said that they'd really found creatine helpful for long COVID. So there can be additional benefits to these supplements, but in terms of muscle wastage, I think the most important thing is that you're eating enough protein each day, which requires work, which requires planning, which requires forming habits. It was something that I, even, being trained as a nutritional therapist for years, didn't actually learn to do for myself until I worked with a more sports-specific coach who had me really weighing, measuring, and logging my food. And then I learned how to eat enough protein. It wasn't easy in the beginning. It didn't come naturally to me in the beginning. And I don't think it comes naturally to many people unless you sit down, work out what your exact needs are, and then make a continuous and concerted effort to do it. But when people do it, they feel so much better from a blood sugar perspective. So I have had vegans who have changed to eating meat to stabilize their blood sugar because they're more interested in getting better. At least in the short term, they're prepared to eat more meat. So that's what I would say about muscle wastage. The final thing is then we also just want to make sure if we are eating all this animal meat that we are able to digest and absorb it. So from a muscle mass loss perspective, if there's maldigestion, malabsorption, gut issues, parasites, that can all interfere with the body's ability to maintain a healthy body weight. Therefore, we do want to deal with any gastrointestinal issues as a separate thing, so that we are making sure what we are eating is getting digested and absorbed to optimize muscle mass as much as possible. Then the next question is also a nutrition-based question. There are some questions about the ketogenic diet. And just to say that there is a podcast episode number 24 of this series, where I talk about the ketogenic diet specifically. I also have a blog on the ketogenic diet, which I wrote more recently, that goes into a lot of details that maybe are not included in that podcast episode, because that podcast episode is a little bit older. And then I also have my blood sugar mini course that you can take for £49, and we go into all this wonderful detail, not only about the ketogenic diet, but fasting, blood sugar management, eating enough protein, some of the things I've already touched on today. But these questions specifically are around, there were 3 questions all on the ketogenic diet, which I just lumped together because we can just discuss them all, which was starting out feeling good on a ketogenic diet and then starting to feel not so good a couple of weeks later. Do we need to support the thyroid when we follow a ketogenic diet? And then how to know if you are adapted to burning fat when you're following a ketogenic diet. So the first thing I'll say is when following a ketogenic diet, it's something that we need to transition into. And I talk about this in more detail in the blood sugar mini course and on my blog, whereas we need to first of all assess if a ketogenic diet is appropriate for us. And then, depending on where we're at in our own journey, make strategic changes to move towards ketosis. because we don't want to destabilize the system. Remember, in chronic illness, we're working with unstable systems, and therefore changes which are big and causing a massive shift physiologically are going to be overwhelming and destabilizing. So we want to create gradual changes to lead someone down the garden path towards ketosis. But in the case of this person, it sounds like they started it and they actually felt okay. So it wasn't destabilizing initially, but now they're not feeling so good. And I have a few thoughts on this, and they're things that we may just want to check out generally for this person, which is, are they eating enough fuel? So very often when people cut out carbs, and if they're not used to eating enough protein, they can start to undereat. So is this person eating enough fuel as a whole? So someone may start the ketogenic diet, their body has a certain amount of reserves they can run on, but as those reserves get depleted, they're going to start to feel not so great. And therefore we need to make sure that there's adequate protein and there's adequate fat in the diet. Calories as a whole are at an optimal level. Another thing to think about is electrolyte depletion. When someone follows a ketogenic diet, their insulin levels go down. And that drop in insulin can encourage the kidneys to excrete sodium. So what can happen is we lose electrolytes through the urine, and that can impact people in many different ways. But we need sodium, for example, for healthy brain function, for healthy neurotransmitter function. And anyone who's experienced POTS type symptoms knows the importance of electrolytes. And the electrolytes are really important for the adrenals, for healthy blood pressure. So we might think, is this person taking an electrolyte supplement? Because perhaps they started the ketogenic diet, they felt good, but as their insulin levels have been going down, they've been excreting lots and lots of electrolytes and sodium from their system, and now they've reached a stage where they're feeling more depleted. In which case, cheap and cheerful, you can add more salt to your food, you can have olives, you can have biltong. I often just will drink a stock cube, like a good quality stock cube with some water, almost like a cup of soup. You can make bone broths and add lots of salt to your bone broth. You can literally add salt to water. Or if you're feeling a little bit more flush, you can supplement with electrolytes. Here in the UK, the brand that we're typically recommending to clients is the Revive electrolytes. They're actually a South African company, which I didn't realize until I spoke with them on the phone, because they've organized a discount code for our listeners, which is Animash. So I'll add a link with this episode, and then you can follow the link if you'd like to buy some of the electrolytes, and you'll get a 10% discount. But when I spoke to them on the phone to discuss the discount code with them, I learned that they're actually a South African company and they've only recently come to the UK. So all the more reason to support them in terms of that South African link. But all of that aside, they've got a high amount of sodium. So one packet of their electrolytes is 1,000 milligrams of sodium. And so personally, what I do is I'll take one of those first thing in the morning when I wake up, just so that I'm supporting my adrenal glands as well with the extra salt at that time of day, because that's when our adrenal glands are working the hardest. So we want to think about, how do we get enough salt, electrolytes, sodium specifically into the diet if you're on a low carb or ketogenic diet. We want to make sure that you're eating enough, and also that you weren't someone who was prone to hypoglycemia before you started the ketogenic diet. So a ketogenic diet can actually be great for somebody who experiences blood sugar lows, because it helps to kind of even out the sort of peak and then crash that can happen when people are eating carbohydrates. But somebody who's more prone to blood sugar lows may also need to eat frequently. So whereas some people may do a ketogenic diet and they may just have 2 meals a day or 3 meals a day, somebody who's more prone to hypoglycemia may follow a ketogenic diet, but they're needing to eat every 2 to 3 hours. So it's important that we eat enough, and it's also important that we eat frequently enough to take pressure off of the adrenal glands, because every time we hit a blood sugar low, it creates more work for the adrenal glands to do. There could possibly be some blood sugar adrenal issues worth exploring here. And it might be the case of, we need to add in some adrenal adaptogens, we need to add in some electrolytes, we need to add in more frequent meals, and make sure that we're eating enough, we're not under eating, or I don't think over exercising is usually a problem in my kind of client base, but something to watch out for as well, because over exercising can be relative to the person's capacity. If you have a small capacity, it's actually very easy to over exercise. And then the final thing I would also think about is detox. So if you're somebody who's got some weight to lose and you start a ketogenic diet, and through the ketogenic diet you start losing body fat, there can also be an increase in toxic load as fat-soluble toxins from the fat cells are entering back into circulation. So if that's the case, we may want to think about how we support detox, whether that's sauna or dry brushing, maybe some nutrients to help with liver clearance, making sure the gut is working well so we can drain toxins through the bowels. So that's a whole other piece we could potentially discuss. But if there's an increase in toxic load here, we want to maybe just think about how we can support that. So then the next piece of this question was about supporting the thyroid gland with the ketogenic diet. I don't know if this is possibly due to the release of Dr. Myhill's new book, and you may have heard me interview her previously on this podcast, where she talks about how we need to have healthy thyroid function to burn fat and for the ketogenic diet to be successful. And I think that's true. It's just not going to be true for every single person. So yes, if somebody doesn't feel like they're getting the most from the ketogenic diet, we might want to consider what the thyroid is doing. We can look at thyroid testing. The testing that I recommend to my clients is the MediCheck's thyroid test, because you can just do it at home. You can get a finger prick kit. You can prick your finger, collect your blood, send it off in the post, and then you can get the results in a couple of days. So we can test thyroid. However, there can be a lot of subclinical thyroid issues. So what that means is that your test results say your thyroid is normal, but you don't feel like your thyroid is normal. So we maybe also need to just bring this into, is there a family history of thyroid conditions? Is there a family history of autoimmune thyroid conditions? Have you tested your thyroid antibodies? Are your thyroid antibodies positive, but your actual thyroid results are normal? And then what is the symptomology? Obviously, fatigue, it can be a symptom of underactive thyroid, but it can be a symptom of pretty much everything. So it's not necessarily evidence that thyroid is the issue, but it could also be things like, is your hair dry? Do you retain a lot of water in your face? Do you have a puffy face? Do you have a goiter or an enlarged thyroid? Is your heartbeat very slow? Do you have intolerance to cold? Do you have low mood or depression? Do you have dry skin? Do you have any issues with menstruation, infertility? Do you have muscle aches? Do you have weight gain? Do you experience constipation? Do you have brittle nails? So these are some of the additional symptoms that could indicate underactive thyroid. And I know Dr. Myhill, in her book, she recommends taking iodine to support the thyroid. My training is that iodine can potentially be problematic if there is a history of thyroid autoimmunity. So I would suggest that if you suspect your thyroid might be an issue that needs supporting so that you can get success from your ketogenic diet, use MediChecks to test your thyroid antibodies. If they come back negative, you can go to town with taking some iodine for the thyroid. If they come back positive, then we need to be a little bit more cautious about how we support the thyroid. And it might be more of a case of supporting the autoimmunity as a whole so that we can improve thyroid function as a whole, which goes beyond the scope of this particular episode. But I do have a blog on my website where I talk more about thyroid autoimmunity, and I will link that here so you can read more about that. Then the final piece of this question, which I hope will be short and sweet, is how do you know if you are fat adapted when you're following a ketogenic diet? And so this is what I get my clients to do. When they start a ketogenic diet, I ask them to test ketones in their urine. And you can buy some urine strips off of Amazon for £10. You'll get like 100 or 200, or you'll get plenty. And when you start your ketogenic diet, you should test positive for ketones in your urine. Then maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks goes on, and you may stop testing positive for ketones in your urine. That doesn't mean you're no longer in ketosis. That can mean that you're fat adapted. And we can confirm that fat adaptation if you're willing to invest in a ketone blood monitor. I personally use the Keto Mojo. So if you test positive for blood ketones and negative for urine ketones, that is a sign of fat adaptation, because it means that you're using the ketones, and that's why you're not urinating them out. Obviously, people with fatigue have a budget. You may not want to also spend money on a ketone monitor. So in which case, what I would encourage you to do is just be really consistent with your diet, so that when you do get that negative urine test, it's not because you actually cheated and you ate some sourdough the evening before, or you had a dessert at a party or something like that. It is genuinely the fat adaptation taking place. So I guess what I'm saying is stick to your diet so there's no room for confusion when it comes to assessing whether you have fat adapted or not. Okay, so then I've got 2 more questions left. The next question is, before increasing exercise, is it crucial to have the basics covered, like sugar levels and inflammation? And so here, the answer to this question comes back to the concept of stability. When we're working with unstable systems, we want to build stability first before we do anything that is destabilizing. So things that build stability are pacing, blood sugar control, nervous system support, stabilizing sleep and circadian rhythms, and removing infections if necessary, although that could also be potentially destabilizing as well. So it's a bit of a gray area. So pretend I didn't say that one. Exercise is a stress. Therefore, when we're adding stress to the body, we need to make sure that the body has the resilience to cope. Therefore, I would want to see that my client has great blood sugar stability, they're pacing their day, they're not eating inflammatory foods, they're getting enough sleep, and they have a good, stable sleep routine before they then start to add on more activity or start to increase physical activity. So those are like the benchmarks. And what I'll say to my clients is, you earn the right to exercising more by doing the boring basics first. Because I have clients who I say to them, you need to stabilize your circadian rhythms, you need to stabilize your blood sugar, you need to work on your nervous system, you need to pace. And they don't listen to me. Or they do it, but they do it half-heartedly, and they don't really commit to it. They pretend they're doing it. They do it like good enough, but really for fatigue recovery, we need it like 95, 98% of the time dialed in. And they're like, it's not working. And I tried to do more exercise and then I crashed. And I'm like, yes, because you're not stable yet. We need to get you stable. So I will probably repeat myself again and again and again on this podcast, but please just know that the basics really matter. And I think I've said this previously, like check in on yourself. Rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10. How am I doing with blood sugar? How am I doing with sleep and circadian rhythms? How am I doing with pacing? How is my nervous system? And when you're like 8, 9 in those areas, then you're ready to work on something destabilizing, which could be addressing infections, or it could be something like adding more exercise into your routine. If you do have some active infections which are destabilizing your system, and they would also be creating inflammation, so I would probably recommend that you deal with those first before you start to introduce more exercise. Then the final question, which is kind of related to exercise, is about post-exertional malaise. And the question specifically is, how do you manage bad post-exertional malaise? And so here I do talk about managing crashes and flares and post-exertional malaise in episode 15 of this podcast. So if you haven't listened to that already, go back and listen. I know that we're up into the 80s, I believe, right now in terms of the episodes, but there's so much wisdom in all of the episodes, all the way back to day 1. So if you haven't listened to some of the earlier episodes, it's definitely worth just working your way through them one at a time. But when it comes to managing bad post-exertional malaise, I think we first of all need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. The bigger picture is not to be in the post-exertional malaise in the first place, which I know is easier said than done. So we need to have the systems in place to prevent the post-exertional malaise, which is the basics that I've just referred to in terms of pacing, blood sugar, nervous system work, sleep and circadian rhythms, addressing active infections. And then we need to think about, okay, we've done all of this stuff, we've got all the stability, we've got our foundations in place, but unlucky, something happened, life happened, we did too much, now we're in a crash. What do we do? And there's no magic. There's absolutely no magic when you are in this place. But what I would say is that over time, you'll probably learn what works best for your body. And I know what works best for my body is to take the pressure off. Because there can be a part of you that's cross, that's frustrated, that's angry, that's beating yourself up. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? You did this to yourself. You shouldn't have done this. You shouldn't have done that. That's not helpful. You want to be as kind and gentle and soft with yourself as you possibly can. And I remember having crashes and flares and just being like, what actually needs to happen today? In life, depending on where you are and how much support you have around you, there may be things that you really do have to show up and do. And then there may be things that you don't. And so I would just say, okay, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. But other than that, for today, I'm just going to rest. And I would just have a really easy day. Just lie down, listen to some music. In the Nurturing Resilience program, we talk about the things that resource you. So resources are the things that help your system feel more resourceful. So for me, it was music, it was being outside, it was sunshine, cuddling the cats. So just like think about showering yourself with regulation from external things, because internally your body is very dysregulated. So we need to draw on the things outside of us to bring in more regulation. Cuddle your partner, a friend, a pet, eat good food. Don't put inflammatory foods into your body. Just eat well, stabilize your blood sugar. You could take some anti-inflammatory supplements, things that sort of support inflammation, oxidative stress, but I've never found that they were a magic bullet. The best thing you can do is work on giving your body space to integrate the disruption that has happened. And then really encourage, bring in stabilizing tools and just things that help your system to feel more stable. Bring in those external resources. Be patient, take the pressure off yourself, be kind to yourself, and trust that, this is how we learn. We learn from these crashes because it helps us to learn our capacity and helps us to refine our routines. So take the learning, leave the rest. Be kind and gentle and caring of yourself and your body and your nervous system. And of course, if you need more support around the nervous system, there's always the Nurturing Resilience program, which you can do self-study. So that brings me to the end of today's episode. I feel like we've crammed in a lot of information. I can see the timer on my recording and it's coming up to 50 minutes. So this seems like a great place to wrap up. If you have enjoyed this episode and you haven't already done so, please leave me a review either on iTunes or Spotify. These reviews just help the podcast rankings, which helps other people find the information that need it. And if you have any specific questions that you would like me to address on the podcast, you can fill out the contact form on my website. Let me know. And I look forward to talking to you all in the next episode.